Good morning and welcome. We're getting started with our inclusion talk today. Thank you all for joining. I'm Master Sergeant Megan Stanislaus, and I will be one of your moderators for today's inclusion talk on celebrating resilience, overcoming visible and invisible obstacles in observance of Disability Pride Month. The focus of today's talk is to discuss inclusion and accessibility for conditions both visible and invisible that affect our airmen, guardians, Air Force and Space Force civilian personnel, and veterans. This opportunity is not only to share personal experiences, but to also discuss ways to ask for reasonable accommodations and for our current service members to set themselves up for success with any disability-related needs after leaving military service. We are hosting this discussion over Zoom so attendees can discuss and ask questions in the chat, and also streaming from Zoom to Facebook Live. If you are comfortable with sharing, please let us know in the chat your name, rank, location, and where you work. If you haven't done so already, please make your Zoom display name your first and last name. Let me introduce my counterpart and fellow moderator, Tech Sergeant Amber Kuth.
Good morning. I am Tech Sergeant Amber Kuth, and I will also be
This isn't good.
Hello, can you hear us? Sorry about that, we lost connection. So to continue on, the format for today's discussion will be a 90-minute inclusion talk that will begin with opening remarks, then introduce our guest panelists. Panelist guests will share their expertise, and lastly, move to open discussion with panelists. To get us started, I would like to first introduce to you Ms. Marianne Malizia, Director, Diversity and Inclusion for the Department of the Air Force. Ma'am, over to you for opening remarks.
Thank you so very much for the introduction, Tech Sergeant Kuth. And Master Sergeant Stanislaus, thanks so much for kicking us off. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending upon where you are joining us from. It is truly an honor on behalf of the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force, Office of Diversity and Inclusion, to have you joining us today for our virtual inclusion talk on celebrating resilience and overcoming obstacles as part of this month's Disability Pride Month. Our talk today is an opportunity to have a really open discussion about the personal experiences of our panelists, and also to learn about ways that individuals with disabilities, whether visual or invisible, can be overcome. There's a lot that the department is doing to enable all of the members to be successful. And I am really looking forward to hearing from our panelists who are experts in the field. Tell us about what some of the best practices are, what accommodations are out there for individuals with disabilities, and also hear some personal stories. So I know there's a lot of great information that's going to be shared. I know the session is going to be both informative and enlightening. And with that being the case, I'm going to leave those to my opening comments so we can actually hear from our panelists. Once again, I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. For those in our audience, thank you so much for attending, for your participation and your support. And back over to you, Master Sergeant Stanislaus.
I'd like to remind those joining that we're monitoring the
So everyone, hang on. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties. It's what happens when you're working in the office in the Pentagon. Technology isn't always our friend.
It's a sign we should be supportive of telework.
All right, sorry about that.
Ma'am, my apologies. This session will be recorded. If you would like to further engage with the members of our panel and want to contact with us, we ask that you contact the Diversity Inclusion Office. One big thing we ask is please do not email the panelists directly. The SAFDI contact email address will be in the chat. Want to share with you our rules of engagement. During this discussion, please practice the platinum rule. Treat others the way they want to be treated. Listen respectfully without interrupting. Listen actively with an ear to understanding other views. Commit to learning, not debating. Criticize ideas, not individuals. Comment to share information, not to persuade. Avoid blame, speculation, inflammatory language. Avoid assumptions about individuals and generalizations about social groups. Lastly, if you have a question for the panel, please enter it into the chat. We will field questions from the chat to the panelists when we can. Our goals are to provide a safe space to exchange ideas, learn about resources available to service members and civilian personnel, and promote adherence to DEIA principles. If during the discussion at any time you feel you need assistance or need to speak with someone, please contact your supervisor, first sergeant, command team, SAPper, or call one of the crisis lines posted in the chat. We'd like to give a big welcome to our panelists. Allow me to introduce Mr. Davis Frank, Associate General Counsel for Civilian Personnel Policy in the Office of the Department of the Air Force General Counsel in the Pentagon. He's the legal advisor to the DAF Barrier Analysis Working Group and has been a part of its leadership team since its founding in 2008. He is currently co-chair of the Disability Action Team, the DAT, and previously served as several years as co-chair of the Women's Initiative Team, the WIT. Prior to coming to the DAF, Mr. Frank was a presidential appointee, first at the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission and then the Department of Labor. During that time, he was the lead negotiator on behalf of the Department of Labor. During that time, he was the lead negotiator on behalf of the White House on the 2008 amendments to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Welcome, Mr. Frank. Sorry.
Next, I'd like to introduce Ms. Kendra Schock, Chief of the Disability and Reasonable Accommodations Division in the Office of Accessibility and Accommodations for the Department of State. OAA aims to create a barrier-free environment and provide centralized disability services and expertise to advance the department's mission worldwide. Prior to joining the State Department in June 2022, Ms. Schock served as Disability Program Manager in the Equal Opportunity Policy Office at Department of the Air Force. She has also worked as the Disability Program Manager for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and as lead consultant for the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy Job Accommodation Network. Welcome, Ms. Schock.
Next, we have joining us Ms. Judith Davis, Outreach Lead and Program Analyst for the Computer Electronic Accommodations Program, or CAP, at the Pentagon. The CAP, which Ms. Davis supports, provides assistive technology and devices as reasonable accommodations, supports individuals and disabilities and wounded, ill, and injured service members throughout the Department of Defense in accessing information and communication technology. Prior to joining CAP, Ms. Davis supported various DoD organizations and NASA in their mission and initiatives for employment of individuals with disabilities, strategic planning, equal employment opportunity compliance, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Welcome, Ms. Davis.
Next is Major Daniel Kiser, Neurodiversity Lead for the Disability Action Team. He is currently serving as the Deputy Director, Learning Sciences and Faculty Education at Squadron Officer School at Maxwell Air Force Base. He provides mentorship and instruction for faculty within a selectively manned organization of instructors and students as part of Squadron Officer School. He has served as intelligence officer in many capacities, enabling operations for flying, tactical air control party, Army, and air operations center staff units across Air Combatant Command, including deployments in support of Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Inherent Resolve. Welcome, Major Kiser.
Next, we have Ms. Reed Brown, the Director of Outreach for the DAP. Ms. Brown is a curriculum developer for a language institute at Joint Base San Antonio, Lackland. She writes oral proficiency skills for aviators and aviation, navigation, communication, models for the English curriculum flight within her squadron. She is also an active DEIA advocate serving in the Disability Action Team, the DAT, and the Black African American Employment Strategy Team, the BEST. Both DAF Barrier Analysis Working Group teams She was one half of the pioneer and instructor team, which facilitated the first 2 classes of young airmen in the special training program for Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. After 6 years of instructing, she transferred to lend her talents to the curriculum flight.
With that, we'd like to turn the discussion over to our panelists, starting with Mr. David Frank. Mr. Frank, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. I guess we have some people from all over the world, so good afternoon. I am David Frank. I am the current lead or co-lead of the Disability Action Team, or DAT, which is one of the 7 barrier analysis working group teams. It is part of the DAF barrier analysis working group called the DAF BAWG. You can't have any kind of Air Force organization without an acronym. So there you go. The DAT is part of the DAF BAWG. The team was created for the purpose of analyzing anomalies in civilian and military workplaces. We look at procedures, practices, policies, with an eye towards identifying their root causes. And if those root causes are potential barriers to equal opportunity, we devise plans to eliminate them. The DAT looks for barriers in employment, in advancement and promotion, in retention, in the application process, and for both military and civilians with disabilities. We are a all-volunteer group. We are one of the smallest of the DAF BAWG teams, but we are small but mighty, as Kendra, our former leader and co-guest speaker today. Kendra's now at the State Department, but she used to call us small and mighty, and we are trying to continue to live up to that. In addition to being a barrier analysis working group that focuses purely on policy, we also serve a purpose as what's called a member and employee resource group, or MERG. Yes, another acronym. The point of a MERG is a way of bringing people together to share a diverse, inclusive environment, to discuss employee issues and contribute to career development. It's sort of an employee support group. It is an adjunct function of the DAT. Our primary role is policy oriented. We are focused on trying to change policies in the Air Force to make the Air Force more accessible to individuals with disabilities, and to specifically to help retain individuals with disabilities in the Department of the Air Force. So what I'm going to do, my role on the panel today, is to walk you through the policy accomplishments and the current lines of effort that the DAT is involved in. We have 7 lines of effort, and this is a way in which anybody, our lines of effort are a way in which anybody in the Air Force, regardless of rank, regardless of location in the Air Force, regardless of expertise even, can help make a contribution to changing Air Force policies. People can help identify policies that they believe need changing. And if we get the barrier analysis work done, if we can produce the data and the support for changing a policy, we actually can make a substantive difference in Air Force policies, and have done so. So let me talk about some of our accomplishments. Within the last few years, within really the last 2 years, we have had several major accomplishments. The most significant, I think, is ensuring access to reasonable accommodation software. For many years, the Air Force CIO has been reluctant to allow certain reasonable accommodation software programs on the Air Force network due to security concerns. After long, this one really has taken years, long efforts, we have finally come to an agreement with the CIO so that we are basically allowing 8 software programs in use by other services to now be used by the Air Force on Air Force systems. So this is a big breakthrough in terms of accessibility programs for individuals with disabilities. In terms of tackling the issue of COVID, which is of particular concern to individuals with disabilities who tend to be more likely to be at higher risk from severe disease under COVID. We have put out guidance for individuals with disabilities who need reasonable accommodation or are recovering from COVID. And we have been active in providing guidance to the relevant Air Force organizations that have been drafting both COVID guidance and eventual return to workplace guidance. Those are all still, well, the existing guidance has obviously been issued, but the return to workplace guidance is still in the works. So we are still continuing to work to help shape that. We have developed guidance on service animals for airmen, both military and civilian. And we have revitalized a disability group on the MyVector employee development internal website to the Air Force. So those are some of our accomplishments. And let me talk about our 7 lines of effort. And then I'm going to give you my commercial, which is we're looking for volunteers. Okay, our first line of effort is to ensure accessibility of physical and virtual workplaces. We are building on what the accomplishment I discussed a moment ago about software programs. We are now looking to develop IT solutions to allow for the tracking of reasonable accommodation requests. Believe it or not, that is not done through a computerized process in the moment. So that is certainly would help the process of expediting accommodation requests. Our next line of effort is to improve the value of the report that we submit to the EEOC every year. It's called the MD 715 report. It is a huge collection of data and barrier analysis that we are required to submit. Every federal agency is required to submit every year. We are working to try and take the data that we submit to the EEOC and improve ways that we can actually use that data to analyze our own shortcomings in the Air Force. Our next line of effort is to improve the rate of self-identification of individuals with disabilities. We know there are a lot more people with disabilities in the Air Force than have self-identified. There are 2 ways you can self-identify. There is a paper form that all civilian employees are expected to be given an opportunity to fill out. It is a voluntary form, but they are supposed to be given the opportunity to fill out the form when they onboard. In addition, everybody who is a current employee can update their disability status at any time in the DC Pass program. And I'm going to, Kendra will be able to tell me exactly what the name of the computer program is where you can, thank you, MyBiz, thank you, where you can update your self ID as an individual with disability. This is confidential. We don't send this information to your supervisor, but the purpose of collecting the information is to help the Air Force understand our workforce and to know what we need to be doing for people with disabilities. It also, if you need an accommodation in the future, lays the groundwork for it. Our fourth line of effort is to ensure equal access to developmental opportunities. We have 3 kinds of developmental opportunities we're working on. We want to inform individuals with disabilities of training opportunities currently available to them. We want to increase the number of individuals with disabilities in Air Force existing internship programs. And we also want to create new training for the disability program managers throughout the Air Force so that they can be better able to do their jobs. The sixth line of effort is neurodiversity. Major Kiser is going to brief on this one in detail, so I don't want to steal his thunder, but this is one we spent a lot of time on. Neurodiversity means looking at issues like autism spectrum disorders or even ADHD. The next line of effort is to implement centralized funding for all reasonable accommodations. Right now, there is centralized funding only for reasonable accommodations that relate to training. It is our goal to have a centralized pot of money so that organizations can access that money from anywhere so that they don't have to dip into their own funds, because they have a legal obligation. All Air Force organizations have a legal obligation to provide accommodation regardless of cost, because we legally, our ability to pay is based on the budget of the entire agency, not an individual organization. And since we all know the size of our budget, we know that the budget of the Air Force will never be considered not able to fund any reasonable accommodation. But we do have organizations that say they can't afford an accommodation, but that's not a legally acceptable reason not to provide one. So we're working on trying to obtain centralized funding. And the last of our lines of effort is to develop guidance on airmen, both military and civilian, with post-traumatic stress. So those are our lines of effort. I will be happy to take questions about this. I think we're going to do questions at the end. I have a lot of experience working with the DAT team. We also have some really good people on our panel who can help answer questions about our lines of effort. So now the commercial. We meet monthly via Teams on the fourth Thursday of the month at 2 o'clock. For those looking at a calendar, that is today. We are meeting at 2 o'clock, 1 hour after this event ends. It is open to anybody in the Department of the Air Force, military or civilian, regardless of rank, regardless of location, regardless of career field, regardless of whether or not you have a disability. If you're interested in working on any of these 7 initiatives, if you're an individual with a disability who's looking for a place to work on these issues, if you are someone who is just interested in making a difference, regardless of your career field or rank in Air Force policy, this is your opportunity. If you would like to join the DAT, or if you'd just like to come to today's meeting, email our outreach lead, Ms. Rhiannon Brown. I will give you her email address. It's rhiannon.brown@us.af.mil. I will put that in the chat. Email her, and she will send you an invitation to today's meeting, and we'll get you plugged in. We need help. Small but mighty is fun, but we would rather be bigger and mightier. So we are looking for volunteers. So please join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frank. We're going to go over to Ms. Kendra Schock.
Well, good morning, almost good afternoon here, good evening, good night, wherever you may be in the Air Force. Thank you for the opportunity and the invitation to meet with you today. As David mentioned, I am now with the Department of State, and I've been there for about 6 weeks. So I'm learning an entire new language of acronyms, a whole new culture. I'm learning to navigate downtown DC again, which I've not had to do in several years. So it's been an interesting transition. David asked me to join the group today to kind of talk about some of the things that we've accomplished in the past, both in my role as a disability program manager for the Department of the Air Force, and always with support of the DAT. So just very quickly, I actually started at Air Force back in July of 2012. So I was there until June of 2022. So I think if we do the math correctly, that's about 8 years. When I arrived at Air Force from the EEOC, Air Force did not have a policy on providing reasonable accommodations. We had guidance on how to do it, but we didn't have any codified published policy. And I learned very quickly in a military organization that without written policy, it was very difficult to convince managers and supervisors, especially if they were uniformed military managers and supervisors of civilian employees, that we have a legal obligation to provide reasonable accommodations. So one of the first things we did was get to work on reasonable accommodation policy, which took, oh gosh, David, was it 2 years to publish our first policy? It was really.
I think so. It was a struggle.
It was brutal, and my first experience with writing policy at Air Force. So at one point we had adjudicated over 1,000 comments on this policy that was only about 90 pages long. So it was interesting. It was great that there was that much interest, and we had a lot of input throughout the entire Air Force on this policy. So eventually, finally, in December of 2014, 2015. AFI 36205 was born. And it was really one of the best Christmas presents I have ever received, because so much time and effort and tears went into developing that policy for reasonable accommodation. So we were all very proud of that policy. I'm still very proud of that policy. I think it was written, thank you, Wally. It was written very well. And then a few years after that, under one of the secretary initiatives at the time, we had to combine that AFI with other AFIs. So it became part of an EO AFI. And I believe it's still part of AFI 362710. I want to say chapter 13, but now I don't remember, but it's in there. And I also recognize that there are probably eminent changes coming related to diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Air Force. So just be aware that that policy may be changed and very, very soon. So in the 8 years that I was the disability program manager at the Air Force, we developed policy. We implemented training, mandatory training for managers and supervisors on the Air Force's policies for providing reasonable accommodation. As David mentioned, we after much, again, struggle, heartache, frustration, in about 6 years, it took me to get 8 pieces of reasonable accommodation software approved for use on the Air Force network. So that was a huge milestone, both for Air Force and for the DAT, so that now we had software that is available for individuals with disabilities. I think one of our greatest accomplishments during the time that I was with you was the increase in the participation rate of individuals with disabilities. So I think the garbage truck is out there. When I started in 2012, the representation rate of individuals with disabilities was 6%. When I left in June of 2022, that representation rate had increased over 14%. In the representation rate for individuals with targeted disabilities, those are the most severe disabilities, was 0.7% when I started in 2012. And when I left in June, we had reached our goal of over 2% participation rate. So it's not an easy task in an organization that has a kind of a military mindset, where when you talk about disclosure of disability and accommodating individuals with disabilities, it's really a foreign concept for most of the individuals that we work with at the Department of the Air Force. And also then finally, I'll close, during the time that I was a DPM, Air Force did manage to win a couple awards here and there for having the best disability program within the Department of Defense of the large components. So we regularly beat out Army and Navy for this award. I think we were first given it in 2012, and then we won it every year after that until 2016. We then, I think it went to Navy after that, and then to Army once, I think, just to make everybody happy and play nice. We won it again in 2018, 2020, and 2021. So even though I'm no longer
keeping score, virtually, I think you were here 8 years, Kendra. So we won 6 of the 8 years. Kendra was our disability program manager. So,
and I just happened to compensate. One of the award certificates is behind me. You know, we get this beautiful plaque, and we get a beautiful trophy, and we all get our pictures taken, and then they take it away, and I never see it again. So because of COVID, the last 2 award ceremonies were held virtually. So they actually sent me the award for Air Force at my home. And since I haven't been back to my office, you know, in 2.5 years, I've kept this one certificate. But so I'm hopeful for 2022. I've not been notified, and I don't know if David has been, what the status of the next award is. But it's just great to be recognized by an organization for the efforts that we have achieved over the years. David and I know that there's a lot of work yet to do, and that's what the DAT is here to help push the ball a little further. We've got some big rocks to tackle when you're talking about centralized funding for reasonable accommodations. But I'm confident that you have the support of the DAT, and I understand there's support now from leadership for this. So I wish you all well and good luck with that.
Thank you so much, Ms. Schock. I'd like to open the floor to Ms. Judith Davis.
Thank you very much for having me. Is the PowerPoint slide coming up? Otherwise, I can freestyle it. I'm just gonna go ahead. Oh, there it is. And while the slides are coming up, I can certainly attest to the greatness of the Air Force in all activities revolving disability employment, accessibility, equity, inclusion, because of my capacity at another office that led the disability award ceremonies. Air Force was always one of our superstars. So this is, it's not a coincidence. So I'm very grateful to be here today in my capacity as a CAP outreach team lead. And it's great to be able to bring all of my activities together, whether it was Air Force, National Guard, or Army or Air National Guard offices. So today I'm here in my capacity as a CAP outreach team, but definitely with the aim to serve the Air Force. Next slide, please. I'll provide a quick overview on what CAP does, who our CAP customers and services, and what our services are, and how to request accommodations, how our budget process works, and then some resources. I'm going to try to sum it all up. It's a very extensive and detailed presentation, and I can make it available to all attendees after we're done with this presentation. But in the interest of time, I'll just give a recap so you can just keep rolling the slides. Next slide, please. The background, CAP was established in 1920, and it was started as a centralized funded program to provide accommodations to employees of the Department of Defense. Later on, it was expanded to the remaining the federal government agencies. And then in 2020, it was rolled back to only make it available to the Department of Defense, even though the assessment feature and the evaluation feature are still available to other government agencies as well. But currently, the no cost, reasonable accommodation, assistive technology availability is only provided to the Department of Defense. Basically, our mission is the same as yours, to provide assistive technology and accommodations to support DoD federal employees with disabilities and wounded, ill, and injured service members. And although this says throughout the federal government, but currently only the Department of Defense. Next slide, please. And as Mr. Clark, I think was it, said, it's the law. This is, a lot of people say this is just a feel-good program, but the reality of it is, yes, it should feel good to add value to people with disabilities. And at the same time, this is not a do it if you feel like it program. It is the law. The Rehab Act of 1973 mandates that we or agencies are required to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified applicants and employees with disabilities. And later on, it was expanded to ensure that service members with disabilities, limitations, or who are wounded and ill or injured are afforded the same equity. Next, please. And the Section 508, 501, 504, and 508 are the key areas that anyone who was in the need to provide a quick synopsis should remember. Next, please. And furthermore, the Department of Defense Instruction 1031, where CAP, or the Computer Electronic Accommodations Program, was established and supported, was put in place. The next one, please. And then DOTI 625.22, where the portion for wounded, ill, and injured service members was also added. So this is the law. This is not up for debate. It's not only the right thing to do, it's the law to make assistive technology available to those who qualify and have disabilities. Next, please. During COVID, we were met with an unprecedented circumstance where overnight we had to figure out how we're going to meet the mission, how we're going to continue to provide services and assistive technology to basically anyone who was now forced to work from home, and making sure that those ordered pieces arrived at each individual's home address, where previously everything was shipped to one's office or whatever the official duty address was. Overnight, leadership managed to make exception to policies and make sure that every employee was able to receive those services from home. It has not changed yet. We accomplished something great, and now we're going to have to do it backwards, where when the return to the workplace time begins, which in some cases it has already begun, we have to figure out a way to make the same thing happen, except now the offices and cubicles and workstations that have not been touched in 2 years have to be refreshed, updated, cleaned, whether software updates or just replace the whole device that was there, and making sure that individuals who will continue to work from home as well as from the workplace are afforded the same opportunity to be successful in meeting the essential duties of their jobs. So that's an undertaking that's going to require careful planning, inclusive planning, but we're here for it, and we're just waiting for leadership to give us our marching orders so that we can start that process as well, so that we make sure we're compliant, but that we continue to add value. Next, please. Who are our customers, and what services do we provide? Technology and associated training for those in need, comprehensive needs assessment and technology demonstrations, and ensuring that individuals who are conducting these jobs on their respective levels have the training required to be able to provide the services on their end, kind of train the trainer, making sure that disability program managers, reasonable accommodation coordinators are able to explain to their customers at their home office or home base what it is CAP does and how we can add value to them. Next, please. DOD employees with disabilities, active duty service members with functional limitations or wounded and ill, as we said earlier, DOD managers who are ready to hire and accommodate before you bring the employees on board, as well as just agencies who are looking to ensure that their programs and services are accessible, are our main customers. That doesn't mean that respective offices and components can't have their own centralized funds or their own reasonable accommodation availability from their end, but CAP is here to provide that service on the greater scale, with the understanding that at the end of the day, the agency is responsible to ensuring that their employees have what they need to be successful in conducting their jobs and completing their jobs. Next, please. As we said earlier, CAP supports active duty service members in the recovery and rehab. There was a misconception and notion in the past that if you're a service member and you have a disability, that concludes your military service and you should get out or separate. That is not necessarily the case nowadays, because we have so many assistive devices and technologies that are making it possible for service members to remain in uniform and have the assistive technology necessary to continue to be successful in their jobs. And we have plenty of examples, and we had a plethora of service members who received accolades and awards based on being able to continue to serve despite a disability that they were faced with while in service. Next, please. Just adding, you don't have to go back, but just adding to that, service members who are currently in the med board or undergoing a medical board to separate or retire, sometimes are reluctant to indicate that they have a disability or that they're in need of assistive technologies to continue to do their job and be successful in doing their job, because they're trying to be responsible stewards of the government's funding and say, well, I'll separate whenever that is, whenever the board concludes the requirements. And we tell them, until the DD 214 hits, you are eligible and you are entitled to receive accommodations. And the beauty of it is, while the rule states that assistive technology provided remains the agency's property, for service members, when they leave, when the DD 214 hits, whatever assistive technology they receive from CAP remains their property. They can take it to wherever their next journey takes them. That may make their life easier, where they're able to say, I need something and I'm bringing it with me until that agency, whether it's corporate sector or government, is able to secure funding or make those services available to them. So if you know a service member in this scenario and situation, please encourage them to seek the services that are available to them. So how does the request process work? We encourage everyone, even as someone previously said, even if the disability is not very apparent, but there are issues, whether it's dexterity issues or neck issues or headaches, and there's a suspicion that I might be able to do my job better if I had something available, but I don't quite know what that something is, call us. Allow us to conduct an assessment free to you and your agency. We will identify what type of work it is you do, what do the essential tasks and duties of your job look like, and what are the issues that are causing you or affecting your ability to perform your job. And then we will determine what it is we think you need, and evaluate what solutions they're available. And then we make our recommendations, and we will encourage you to complete the request process, and it will be made available to you at no cost, with the caveat that your supervisor or the disability program manager at your respective office, whoever is the point of contact to us, will be made aware that you requested accommodations, but that shouldn't have any type of adverse effects on you as an employee or as a service member. Please feel free to put any of your questions in the chat and I'll answer them. And please also let me know if I'm out of time. I know I have a lot of slides. Next slide, please. What are the core disability areas that we service and that we provide services for, or information and training for? Is dexterity. It could be needing an alternative keyboard or an input device or voice recognition software. The next area is vision. Someone might need screen readers or magnifying software or different screens. Hearing, assistive listening devices, video phones, and captioning services. Then cognitive and learning. This hearing and the cognitive are probably areas that service members are most impacted by, whether it was someone who was deployed and suffered an injury, or whether it's PTSD or any type of impairments that were a direct result of being a service member. We have technology that help with all these areas: communication, voice amplifiers, word prediction software, or communicating devices. If you browse through our new website, you will find a large list of assistive technology that you never knew existed. And I'll add to this: if there's any technology, any piece of technology you know you need or you have found, but it's not available on CAP's website, please tell us what it is, where you got it from, and let us know that you need it. And we will have our acquisitions team do the research to make sure that we're able to procure it in order to enable the service member or the employee to have what they need to complete the essential duties of their job. Next, please. I'm not going to go too much into this to make sure that I'm responsible with the time, but we have a relaunch soft website, cap.mil. It's very intuitive. Every person who has a PIV or CAC is able to create an account or register an account, and to be able to submit requests, whether it's for assistive technology or for training or for demonstrations, or even to request CAP's.
Looks like we're having some technical.
I don't know if it was just on my end, but it had said meeting was disconnecting.
Ma'am, I think that was all of us, but we are going to shift. Is there any way that you can highlight the key points on this slide, ma'am?
Yes, so I had said next slide, but after this, it'll just show how to request an accommodation, and we can do that in an individualized basis. And I just want to go to 3 slides down where the contact information is available on the slide. We can go further down. There you go, the training, and then we're on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. Please follow us, tag us. We will do the same when we have events. We have quite a few events coming up. And then also the next slide will tell you how to get in touch with us. Our phone number, like I said, we're at the Mark Center as well as at the Pentagon. If you're at the Pentagon, knock on our doors. Right now, we're only open Tuesdays and Thursdays, but we're looking to shift to daily openings. Email us. Between these 4 different ways of contacting us, we're available to you, and let us know what we can do to do better. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. Over to Major Kiser.
Hey, good morning. If you could spotlight me, that'll probably make it easier to read. Let's see if I can do it. There we go. Perfect. All right. Hi, Major Dan Kiser. I'm here to talk about neurodiversity. So Mr. Frank mentioned a little bit about what neurodiversity actually is. It is a broad spectrum of individuals characterized by key neurological differences. It includes people on the autism spectrum, people with ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, social anxiety disorders. All of those fall under the neurodiversity umbrella. The reason that we started this under Master Sergeant Retired Shale Norwitz, who I think is on with us today as well, there's a huge, probably undiagnosed population of neurodivergence within the Air Force. Because they are undiagnosed or not ID'd in any way, they don't have those accommodations. So we stood up this program to accept neurodivergent individuals within the Air Force through legal policy and through recruitment standards and retention standards to support them make sure that they have the medical resources that they need and the challenges associated with neurodiversity, and then to empower them. And that's really the thing that I think everybody here can help out with. Typically, autistic individuals are unemployed at a rate of about 80%. That's huge, and it's due largely in part to things like social awkwardness, or inability to effectively communicate, or thinking in a divergent way from the direction of the organization. However, as we continue to push for innovation, neurodivergence really is a superpower. We just need to, A, get to know our people, understand how they think, and leverage them appropriately to create a path where they can be successful on their terms. Provide those reasonable accommodations. They may look different than what we saw with CAP just now. It could be just turning the lights down a little bit, giving them the opportunity to get away from some of the sensory overload, whether that's noise canceling headphones, whether that is earplugs so that they can focus and do some deep work. Understanding the social limitations. So understanding like, hey, we probably don't interview as well as a neurotypical individual. We probably struggle to A, get to the point, I know I do, or B, struggle to effectively communicate what it is that we're trying to say. Additionally, the impact of stress and overstimulation. So I hit on it a little bit, but if there is if there's a sensory overload, that causes issues in performance of neurodivergent folks. So taking a look at how to create an environment where these people can be successful is huge. And then additionally, we are looking at kind of subsidiaries beyond just autism spectrum disorder. ADHD, people have to go off their medication in order to join the military. So kind of hitting on Colonel James's point there. I know, but we are looking at ways to get around that. But first we have to hit on, it's a disqualifying condition for entry, autism spectrum disorder is. And then for ADHD, you have to be off your medication for a certain period of time in order to join. So we are looking at that under that accept line of effort. But really as leaders, there's something that we can do without having to figure out who in your office is neurodivergent. Just get to know your people and what they need in order to be successful. Encourage that introspection. And if you are interested in joining us, hit us up. We have a Slack channel. We have a Teams channel. Just reach out through SAFDI and they will get you in contact with us. But with that, I will hand it back over to Master Sergeant Stanislaus and Tech Sergeant Kuth.
Thank you so much, Major Kiser. I'm going to hand it off to Miss Ree Brown. Ma'am, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Full disclosure, I'm going to be reading my story because it is very personal and I have a broken memory, and you'll see why in just a moment. So thank you for giving me a few minutes to share my experience as a Department of Air Force civilian. I have only in the last few years even called myself disabled. Having an invisible, silent neurological disorder, I live each day without others even being able to tell because there's no real evidence of my disability. In fact, I have type 1 narcolepsy with cataplexy. Right now, I'd imagine you're picturing one of two things: some theatrical representation of narcolepsy, including a character instantaneously falling out mid-sentence, or maybe you're picturing the face of someone you know who struggles with narcolepsy. I'd wager a bet on the first one, as there are so few folks that have it and even fewer who share it with others. Most narcolepsy is diagnosed somewhere in the early 20s. I was diagnosed at 27 after years of being sure I was going crazy while struggling with it. I once drove from Universal Studios Hollywood to the base of Big Bear Mountain with no idea how I got there. For those of you who don't know, that's pretty far. That was really scary. So I was diagnosed back in 2005. Nationally, there are only about 1 in 2,000 adults, or roughly 200,000, who suffer from narcolepsy, and only 25% of us are diagnosed and receiving treatment. Since sleepiness and fatigue tend to run rampant throughout adults, especially in America, where we're controlled by our calendars and clocks, simply being tired does not begin to describe what it's like to have narcolepsy. You cannot know fatigue or being tired until you've suffered from a sleeping disorder. I can walk around looking normal and would be a millionaire if I had $1 for every time someone said, well, you don't look that tired, as some sort of attempt to make me feel better. That's my guess anyways, as to why people say it. But those of you who have disorders or disabilities probably know what I mean. However, I digress. This is about my journey as a disabled civilian trying to navigate the winding road that is the reasonable accommodation request process. My story begins as an instructor for the Air Force. When I started 10 years ago, I had to be at work no later than 7:15 with an earliest report time of 6:45. Now you should know that the very nature of narcolepsy is a struggle with excessive daytime sleepiness due to not really ever sleeping at night. This is because we don't produce a hormone that keeps all of you asleep. So imagine having only the equivalent of cat naps every time you went to sleep. That's the easiest way I can simplify what happens when you have narcolepsy. So monotonous activities like driving, reading, or sitting still triggers our bodies to shut down. For this reason, people like me tend to move a lot or look fidgety, and it's not. It's just an effort to stay awake. So back to the story. In 2012, when I started at my current job, I had a live-in nanny because I'm a single mother. The nanny made sure I was awake and then went on with their duties. I struggled to stay awake while driving to and from work, but truly felt I was in control. Silly me. Fast forward a few years, I no longer had a nanny and suddenly realized how much I relied on them to wake me in the morning. I started waking late, leaving late, and thus arriving to work late. It was sporadic, but more often than I was comfortable with as a classroom teacher. So you can imagine how my leadership saw it. I was forced to share my medical issues at that time. My direct supervisor, while nice and caring, was not the advocate I needed. I felt as though I was lost in the wilderness of trying to figure out how to best support our mission without letting my disorder affect my job too much. My supervisor, sadly, was not trained or experienced enough to really help me. Long story short, I was tossed back and forth between him, CPO, and my doctor, while CPO tried to cram me and my round disorder into their square hole. We simply didn't fit. I did my part to recommend temporary solutions until I could find a new position in my organization. I requested to move to the curriculum department as their schedules seemed less rigid. My leadership denied my request and insisted I stay in the classroom, all the while punishing me every time I was late, which was more frequent due to the stress of knowing that I'd likely wake up late, have to drive while possibly still asleep, and then have to face my classroom of students who began to grow worried about me. It was a mess. At no point was the RA process properly executed, and I was still too ignorant of how it was supposed to work to know any better. It all came to a head when I was en route to work one morning thinking I was fully awake. I quickly found out that I was not when I was facing a Mack truck headed straight toward me on Highway 90. Its horn startled me awake, and I ran off the road, almost down the embankment, to avoid being smashed. I was so shaken up that I called my supervisor and told him I was going back home. I cried. I was traumatized. I thought I was awake, and I almost lost my life that day. I was too timid to drive for nearly 2 weeks after that. For this reason, I was permitted to telework, but only for 2 weeks. What I needed was compassionate leaders and a new plan. Eventually, I did succeed in getting transferred to the curriculum department in 2018 after much effort. Upon entering the curriculum flight, I requested to telework and was promptly told, "We don't allow telework," without any true justification as to why. So I continued to do all I could to get to work safely. Eventually, I gotten an RA approved to let me start work as late as 10 a.m. without penalty, so I could avoid driving before I was truly ready. Remember, I cannot always tell if I am truly awake or not, but at least it was a good start. Fast forward to March 2020, and suddenly the whole organization was teleworking. So by April 2021, my then section chief approved my doctor's request to keep me on mostly telework with only reporting to base for required trainings, all calls, etc., in order to reduce unnecessary driving. Since we had successfully teleworked in my flight for the last 2.5 years, it made sense that we don't telework was a silly response at this point. However, upon returning to work post-COVID, my commander chose not to honor my previously approved RA for mostly telework. The upsetting part was the counteroffer, which would allow me to telework, but only on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I rejected that counteroffer. Ironically, the reason for denying my RA was still because the mission cannot support telework, even though we all teleworked for over 2 years. And the worst part is, part of my flight still teleworks 2 days a week. So you can see this is not really a response to my RA request, but an offer to do exactly as half the flight is already doing. I felt very devalued, as if my personal health and safety were not important to my leadership. So today, I'm in the process of looking for a reassignment and hoping CPO can find me a position at Fort Sam or Randolph, both closer to my house, to see if the Air Force has anything I can do to keep my skills and talents in its hands. I'm over halfway through the 60-day process with no offers yet. If not, I'm told medical retirement may be an option. As a single parent, all I can do is hope it works out for the best. I've given a faithful 10 years, but I'm essentially being pushed out because of my disability. I have to believe there is an agency out there who will value me as a part of the Air Force family despite my disability and is willing to accommodate me. I still have so much to contribute. Thank you for your time and attention.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much, Ms. Brown. Appreciate you sharing your personal experience. We would now like to open the discussion to everyone. We have received a few questions in the chat, but it seems like people are being very responsive and answering them as well. So please check out the chat. But we'd like to open it up. So I will kick it off with a question. Please add in more questions and we will go from there. So to the panel as a whole, whoever'd like to take this first, what do you wish your fellow airmen, guardians, and teammates knew about your experience as a person with disabilities in the Air Force?
I'll go first. I wish people felt comfortable with asking, hey, is everything okay? I once heard someone gossiping too loudly that they thought I was either drunk or hungover. Because when the sleepiness starts to kick in, I tend to bump into walls. And I learned to just walk along the wall with my hand to hold myself up. And I was usually en route to my supervisor to let her know I was having a narcoleptic moment and I needed to sit somewhere without looking like I was just sleeping. Those type of things are hurtful because you shouldn't accuse people in any way. If you thought I was drunk, maybe the best thing to do would be to pull me aside and talk to me, not talk to others about it. So assuming you know what's wrong is never the right way to go. And if you're not close enough with a person that you might have a concern about, maybe find someone who is close to that person and have that person speak to them because gossip and rumors is never helpful. It's only hurtful, especially when it's not true. And the last thing I'll say to that part is, remember, not all disabilities are visible. In fact, many, many are not. And you never know what someone's struggling with to where you might be giggling to yourself thinking I'm hungover. Meanwhile, I'm just trying to not fall down and I'm trying to stay awake. So just some food for thought.
Thank you for that. Ms. Davis, you had your hand up?
Yes, thank you. Two things. We have to understand this work that we're doing is work of the people and for the people, right? We can talk all we want about the laws and legal and what is and isn't valid, but at the end of the day, what we do is about equity. It's about adding value to people. It would be hypocritical if we said Diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. That's, you know, there's a new letter added to that, and we don't live up to it. The way we live up to it and the way we make a difference is in the way we're willing to change a culture, an environment where employees, whether they're service members, and service members are severely impacted because there are certain requirements and expectations and stigma that goes along with that, or employees for that matter, don't feel comfortable requesting reasonable accommodations or assistive technology because of what might follow, that means we're failing somewhere. We're failing. And if there's not an environment that makes employees, service members, and civilians comfortable to inquire, to want to know, to ask questions, and to essentially figure out solutions that would help them meet the essential duties of their jobs, we, meaning leadership or managers, we're failing. We have some serious work to do. We're in the people business, and it's about adding value and not just saying we're compliant because our numbers add up.
Thank you for that, ma'am. Major Kiser, you had a comment?
Yes, ma'am. Just one thing from the active duty perspective. When I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, the first thing mental health said to me was, just so you know, this can be used as justification for an administrative discharge for any reason. That right there creates an environment of hesitancy. People will not want to disclose a lot of their hidden disabilities if they know that it's a matter that they can be discharged for. That's scary. So what we need to do is create an environment, even within our team, of trust. And a lot of times trust is a result of vulnerability in a safe place. Knowing what you can say and what you can't say, what needs to be reported, what doesn't need to be reported. And ultimately knowing enough about yourself and about your teammates to get the mission accomplished is really how we're going to get beyond things like petty bullying, discrimination, and things like that. You have to know your people, and you have to be able to trust your people. That's really the big thing. People right now, hidden disabilities as active duty service members aren't going to want to say anything because they're scared of that threat of administrative discharge. So it's going to come from the top. Senior leaders have to show that it's okay and lead by example and share their stories if they're able to.
Thank you, Major Kiser. Mr. Frank, there's a question in the chat for you. How would you grade the Air Force's performance when it comes to protecting uniform wearers with disabilities? Also, what will be a top priority for you improving that?
How would you? I lost you at the end.
How would you grade the Air Force's performance when it comes to protecting uniform wearers with disabilities? Also, what will be a top priority for you for improving that?
Uniform wearers with disabilities. I think it's a problem because there is no legal protection for uniform wearers with disabilities. So it is different. When we started out the DAT, we only focused on civilians because the legal protections are only for civilians. I do think we have made a lot of progress in the last 10 years that we now are more cognizant, I think partly because of the number of wounded warriors trying to stay in the Air Force military ranks. I think some of these initiatives like we're doing on neurodiversity shows there is a willingness to be sensitive to these issues, but it's still you're still fighting a mindset. The military mindset is, I'm not disabled, I can do the job, I can fight through it, or you should be fighting through it. And therefore, it is a mindset that we have to try and counter. That just because you have a disability in the uniform services, that doesn't mean you need to leave. And we lose a lot of talent if we do that.
Thank you, sir. We have another question from the chat from Chris Drury. What kind of rules are in place for people in a wheelchair when the building I work in only has one wheelchair accessible bathroom? I apologize. So let me repeat that. What kind of rules are in place for people in a wheelchair? For their specific experience, the building that they work in only has one wheelchair accessible bathroom.
David, I can answer that.
Go for it. I thought you'd jump in.
Air Force, as all federal agencies, are required to comply with the Architectural Barriers Compliance Act, not the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there are minimum requirements for compliance with the Architectural Barriers Compliance Act. And that information is available on the Access Board's website, what that would be. So you could go to the Access Board's website and find out what is the minimum requirement for accessible bathrooms in a building that size. And off the top of my head, I don't know what that is. So there's an issue of accessibility, but there's also the issue of accommodation. Assuming the building has the required number of accessible bathrooms, if you as an individual who works there needs a reasonable accommodation to access the bathroom, you could request assistance as a reasonable accommodation, whether they create an accessible bathroom closer to where you work or whatever you may need. So I encourage you to submit a request for reasonable accommodation if that would be helpful.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question we have is from Ms. Brown. Is there any accountability to leadership and commanders to accommodate when possible, even if they don't want to, like my situation?
Well, David might have a different answer to this question, but I think the accountability comes through the EO process. Any individual who believes they've been denied a reasonable accommodation has the right to submit a complaint through the EO process. I highly encourage people to do that when it's necessary and to make use of available mediation to resolve these issues before it becomes an actual formal complaint. But you also can contact your disability program manager within your organization. That individual can assist you with the reasonable accommodation process and work with you and that supervisor to come to an effective accommodation plan.
I think that's fair. I mean, the accountability is ultimately the legal obligation. And obviously, if we're not meeting the legal obligation, you can, in fact, file an EEO complaint. And that's true, at least on the civilian side. Obviously, on the MEO side, there is no legal protection. But the accountability on the civilian side, if you're not in a situation like Rhi was describing, yes, I mean, you go to your disability program manager or go to your EO office and talk informally. You don't have to go in and file a complaint. You can just go in and describe the situation and ask for assistance with the interactive process, which is the process by which a reasonable accommodation is supposed to be addressed, which is an informal process between the employee and the supervisor. So what the supervisor wants to offer may not be what's legally required. An employee is not entitled to the accommodation of their choice, but they are entitled to an effective accommodation. And if what the supervisor is offering is not effective, you can go back and push back and say, no, this doesn't allow me to do my job, and therefore you need to continue the accommodation process. If you don't know who your disability program manager is at your installation, then go to the EO office and they should be able to tell you who it is. It's probably someone working on a part-time, it's part of their job duties. It's not a full-time job at most installations.
Just to add to that, David, keep in mind that Managers are not required to remove an essential function as a reasonable accommodation. That the purpose of the accommodation is to enable the individual to perform the essential functions of the job. Sometimes it's not possible to accommodate that person because in order to do so, it would eliminate that essential function. And when that happens, that's when we move to try to reassign that person to another position.
Right.
Thank you so much. We have another one from the chat. What is being done to ensure force leadership training?
This is something that is part of training on reasonable accommodation, is something that is part of new supervisor training that is mandatory. And it is also part of SLOC training, which is for senior leaders. It probably, in all honesty, is a 15-minute segment in a 2-day course, but it is in there to alert them to their legal obligations to do this. But there's more that can and should be done, in my opinion. But yes, there is mandatory training.
Thank you for that, sir. We have another question in the chat. If an airman or guardian has a developing or new limiting condition, but when they are reluctant to go to their medical group and have it documented because they have a concern, it may affect their ability to serve. Is there anyone else they can talk to?
Are you talking about a military member or a civilian? If
They specified airman or guardian, but if there's a difference between a civilian or active duty member.
Well, if you're a civilian, you can go to your own doctor. You don't need to go to an Air Force doctor to document your medical condition.
I can speak to the uniform wearer, sir.
Yes, please. I was just going to phone a friend, Dan, so please.
Yeah, no worries. So there are several resources out there. Military One Source, of course, being the most widely advertised. As a service member, they cover up to 12 counseling sessions to kind of help you get a basis. And this is, again, mental health related and kind of anxiety related, which is my personal experience. For other potential hidden disabilities that may require diagnoses or accommodation, unfortunately, you are somewhat limited, having to go through TRICARE, medical group, things like that. Military One Source, you can talk to chaplains, you can talk to MFLAC, Military Family Life Counselor. All of those resources are there. Maybe not trained in specifically, from my perspective, the neurodivergence, but they are somebody that can act as a sounding board and help you get further assistance to perform like you need to. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Major Kiser. So we have one more time. We have time for one more question. This is from the chat, Sarah Dallas. When will the Air Force as a whole start separating the disability program manager as a full-time position for each installation?
Well, that's a great question. That's something that we have advocated for a number of years. And as recently as discussions with the undersecretary before I left the Air Force in May, in my personal opinion now, since I'm no longer part of your group, full-time DPMs are needed at most installations. I think there's an argument for a collateral duty DPM at smaller installations that don't have a large civilian population, but one of the arguments that I've continued to make regarding establishing a full-time DPM and not making that a collateral duty is even on small installations with small civilian memberships, individuals with disabilities can disclose their disability at any time. So just because, we may know the number of individuals with disabilities because they've self-identified using the SF 256, that's only a representation of individuals with disabilities at that location. It's certainly not every individual who has a disability, because we're not required to disclose those disabilities unless we're requesting reasonable accommodations. So, and again, before I left Air Force, I made some very specific recommendations to the Undersecretary of the Air Force. And I think Ms. Malizia is aware of some of those recommendations. So I'm confident that in the effort to support DEIA, the Air Force, that some of those things will be looked at in the future.
Thank you, Ms. Schock. So unfortunately, our time is soon coming to an end. I'd like to offer each of our panel members 1 to 2 minutes if they'd like to offer any closing thoughts, starting with Mr. Frank. Is there anything that hasn't been said that you want us in the audience to know?
Oh, I'm just going to go back to my commercial announcement. This is your chance. If you want to have a real impact on policy Air Force wide, if you want to affect real change, this is an opportunity to do so, to join. And if not the DAT, there are 6 other DAF BAWG teams related to women's initiatives, as Rhi mentioned, African American initiatives, Hispanic, Native American, LGBT, Asian American. I hope I haven't left anybody out. So we have teams that focus on all of these. I have worked with all of the DAF BAWG teams over the years. They do amazing work where you have a chance to get something in front of the Secretary of the Air Force, which, you know, as an E3 at a small base, you would normally never dream of being able to do. This is your chance to really affect Air Force policy. So get involved if you can, if you have the time. Please, you know, reach out to, if you're interested in one of the other teams that I mentioned, reach out to the DI office. If you're interested in the DAT, as I said, please reach out to Rhiannon Brown. And we'd love to have your help and support in trying to change the Air Force for the better for people with disabilities. So, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Over to Ms. Schock.
Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I can't tell you how much I miss all of you and miss working with the DAT. They're a great group of people, and I know you're going to do wonderful things. I've moved to an organization that does have a centralized disability program and centralized funding for disability program. And last week when I found out what the budget was for the disability program, I literally fell out of my chair. I mean, it's 10 times the amount of money that David, Frank, and I have advocated for Air Force to implement for centralized funding. So I think there are certainly ways the Air Force can improve the disability process and the disability program. And I think advocating for full-time disability program managers and centralized funding for reasonable accommodations certainly would go a long way to resolving some of the issues that we've discussed today. Having said that, I've also learned that the grass is not always greener somewhere else. I keep Air Force close to me. I still have my Space Force mug that I use every day. I'm available to assist the group, you know, as I'm able, but I also know that you're also in very capable hands. So I look forward to seeing what the next chapter for Air Force is.
Thanks, Ms. Schock.
Thank you very much. I second everything Kendra said, and as well as Mr. Frank. This is a great platform, and the only way we'll be able to expand the knowledge, the information, the solution finding is if we continue to have platforms like this on a regular basis. This is the only demographic, this is the only group that any one of us, no matter where we come from, no matter what we identify with, can become a member of at any time without it being our choosing, to include those who are currently presenting to be barriers to the solutions that we're presenting, right? And if someone is presenting solutions and tying them to the mission, and there's centralized funds available somewhere to cover those solutions, there's no reason why we can't add value to that person, right? And that's the bottom line. It's going to cost money. Either we can do it the cheap way, or we can do it the expensive way when someone files a complaint that's substantiated, it's going to cost the agency money. So why not do it the right way and foster a culture of value and mission and people value, period, right? We have work to do, and the only way we'll get there someday, and it's ever evolving, so we will never be done learning, is if we continue to have these conversations. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, ma'am, for that. Major Kiser?
Just a few short things. Neurodiversity is a competitive advantage, but we need to get to know our people, leverage those skill sets appropriately, and make sure that those neurodiverse folks don't stay on the fringe, but that we embrace them, bring them into the fold, and help them be successful in a way that suits them the best. So get to know your people and understand neurodiversity's competitive advantage, advocate at the senior levels if you can.
Thank you, Major Kiser. And we lastly go to Ms. Brown.
Hi, thanks all again for coming today and for listening to our stories. My final thought would be, when you're talking about D&I, don't forget the E and the A. Equity, you can't have inclusion without equity. And the A is for accessibility, for those who don't know. So that tries to encompass the needs of the disabled, whether visible or invisible, which is what we're talking about today. You know, try to be supportive of those in need. You don't have to have a wheelchair to have a need, right? And so I just want to point out that if you're talking about D&I, say DEIA. Let's get the DEIA out there to be common so that we can truly be inclusive and really support those who really need it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Brown. And thanks again to all of you for sharing your guidance, resources, and experiences. I have dropped in the SAF DI workflow into the chat. So if you have any further questions, I know we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but we had some great discussion going on in the chat. So just thank you everyone for your full participation. On behalf of all of our Inclusion Talk participants, I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time to discuss with us today. We appreciate your insights and look forward to continue to find ways to spread awareness of inclusivity issues for our airmen, guardian, and civilian personnel. I'd like to offer Ms. Malizia, our Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the Department of the Air Force, the final word. Ms. Malizia, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Tech Sergeant Kuth. Panelists, thank you so much. The information you shared today was beyond what I had expected. And to see the engagement of our audience with the good questions they had and sharing of experience, I think speaks to the value that your perspectives, experiences provided. I'd also like to thank those of you who shared your own personal stories and journeys and were vulnerable, putting yourself out there, because it's only through being able to better understand what individuals' journeys are like that we can fully realize the need, the true need for us to be inclusive, ensure that we are being equitable as we go about our work each and every day. And for those of us that are implementing or have the ability to influence policy programs and procedures to ensure that we are being equitable, and that accessibility piece as well, that we are making opportunities accessible to each and everybody so that they can achieve their full potential. I'm going to say is thank you very much for that. I learned something from Mr. Frank today. We can do commercials. And so I'm going to do a very brief commercial that next week on August 3rd and 4th, we are hosting our first annual Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Conference. I would encourage you, if you have an interest, once again, it's virtual, so you can drop in and drop out as your schedule allows, to please join us. Captain Clark, thank you very much for dropping that link into the chat feature. I do hope to see you there. And once again, panelists, thank you to my team who made sure that this was moderated wonderfully and that everything worked in the background as well. We have folks that are not on camera. Thank you. And to the audience, Thank you for joining us. I hope you join us in future inclusion talks. Everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you for supporting diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Signing off.
Thank you.